something the entire world is watching right now, and most Americans are only getting half the story on. Because when you look at what is actually happening, not what the cable news channels are telling you, not the press briefings from Washington, but the actual geopolitical architecture being assembled in real time, you start to realize that Israel is not just fighting a war in Gaza. Israel is becoming diplomatically encircled by a coalition of powers, the likes of which the post-World War II order has never seen aligned against a single American ally. Turkey, China, Russia, and the European Union, not fully, not formally, but increasingly, unmistakably, are pushing in the same direction. And that direction is against the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu's government. This is not a minor diplomatic spat. This is the slow grinding machinery of a new world order turning its gears. And if you live in the United States, this affects you directly because your tax dollars, your government's credibility, and the long-term strategic position of America on the world stage are all tied to what happens next. So let's sit with this for a moment and think it through carefully, because the details matter enormously here, and the story is far more complex and far more consequential than it appears on the surface. Let's start with Turkey, because Turkey is the most viscerally dramatic piece of this puzzle, and it is also one of the most strategically significant. Turkey is a NATO member. It has the second largest military in the entire NATO alliance. It sits at the crossroads of Europe and the Middle East. And its president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has made opposition to Israeli policy in Gaza and beyond not just a diplomatic position, but a central pillar of his political identity and his regional ambitions. We are not talking about polite disagreement here. Turkey's Istanbul prosecutor's office issued arrest warrants in November 2025 for 37 senior Israeli officials, including the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, the National Security Minister, and the IDF Chief of Staff, on charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Think about what that means for a second. A NATO ally is issuing criminal arrest warrants for the sitting leadership of another American-backed democracy. That is not normal, that is extraordinary, and it did not come out of nowhere. Turkey joined South Africa's lawsuit against Israel at the International Court of Justice in August 2024, accusing Israel of genocide. Erdogan has called for the destruction of Israel in language that would have been unthinkable from a NATO leader just a decade ago. The economic boycott Turkey declared on Israel in May 2024 remains in effect, with Turkey vigorously enforcing it, and yet the trade still leaks through. In the first 7 months of 2025, Turkish exports to Israel totaled approximately 520 million, compared with roughly 3.5 billion in 2024. Which tells you that economics and geopolitics are pulling in opposite directions simultaneously, which is exactly what makes this situation so combustible and so unstable. Turkey needs trade. Turkey also needs to position itself as the leading voice of the Muslim world, and right now those two imperatives are increasingly in conflict with each other. Now here is what makes Turkey's position so strategically dangerous from Israel's perspective, and honestly from America's perspective too. Turkey and Israel are already in a geopolitical rivalry, with Israel's actions clashing with what analysts describe as the Turkish agenda to have strong centralized states in the region rather than fragmented, divided ones. This is the crux of the Syria question. As Turkey scoped out potential military bases in Syria's Homs province and the main airport in Hama province in coordination with the newly established Damascus government, Israel bombed those sites. When you bomb the sites where your NATO ally wants to establish military infrastructure, you are no longer in the territory of diplomatic disagreement. You are in the territory of potential armed conflict, and analysts have said exactly that. If Israel persists on this path, a conflict between Ankara and Tel Aviv will become inevitable, because Turkey cannot accept policies that perpetuate instability on its southern border. And we have to understand why Turkey wants strong states in Syria. Because Turkey's biggest security concern is the Kurdish question. Turkish forces have long battled Kurdistan Workers' Party militants in Iraq and Syria, and Turkey is locked in an escalating struggle with Israel over the future direction of Syria. Israel, meanwhile, has been doing something that American diplomats have actually admitted to. Tom Barak, the US ambassador to Turkey and special envoy to Syria, admitted that Israel would prefer a fragmented and divided Syria because strong nation-states, especially Arab states, are viewed as a threat to Israel. That is not some conspiracy theory from an anti-Western blog. That is the American ambassador speaking on the record. And when Ankara heard that, the message was unmistakable. The United States and Israel are working toward a Syria that serves Israeli security interests at the expense of Turkish strategic interests. That is not a foundation for a lasting alliance, that is a foundation for a rupture. Now let's turn to China, because China's position on Israel is evolving in a way that most Americans are simply not tracking, and it deserves close attention. China's stance toward Israel hardened dramatically after Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack and the ensuing Gaza war. Beijing blocked the UN Security Council resolution condemning Hamas, accused Israel of collective punishment and forcible displacement, and doubled down on pro-Palestinian rhetoric. But here is where it gets more nuanced and more instructive. Since October 7th, China has intensified its support for the Palestinians in the international arena, while consistently avoiding any condemnation of Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and the Houthis, framing all cases of escalation in the Middle East as a result of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Beijing is playing a long game here, and they are playing it with considerable sophistication. What China is doing is not simply reacting to events. China is using the Gaza war as a geopolitical instrument. Every time Beijing issues a statement condemning Israeli military operations, every time a Chinese official stands at the United Nations Security Council and demands a ceasefire that the United States then vetoes, China is broadcasting a message to the global south, to the Arab world, to Africa, to Southeast Asia. We are on your side, and America is not. Beijing has been more direct in criticizing Israel's response to the October 7th Hamas attack, describing Israel's actions in Gaza as beyond the scope of self-defense and as collective punishment, while also criticizing US votes in Israel's favor at the United Nations. This is deliberate. This is strategic communication designed to erode American moral authority in the developing world while positioning China as the responsible power that respects international law and human dignity. Whether you agree with China's framing or not, the strategy is working. And Israel's exports to China fell 28% in the first half of 2025, which means the diplomatic chill is beginning to translate into real economic consequences. China has helped Iran evade sanctions and is reportedly assisting in rebuilding Iran's military capabilities following Israel's operations in October 2024 and the 12-day war in June 2025. So, while Beijing maintains a veneer of neutrality and continues some economic engagement with Israel, it is simultaneously strengthening the military capacity of Israel's most existential adversary. That is not neutrality, that is a carefully calibrated alignment against Israeli security interests, executed with the deniability that Beijing has mastered over decades of strategic patience, and the Americans who need to understand this most urgently are the ones who assume that because China is not formally sanctioning Israel or breaking diplomatic relations, China is somehow sitting this one out. It is not sitting anything out. It is playing every angle simultaneously. Now Russia. Russia's position is somewhat different from China's and Turkey's because Russia is simultaneously under its own severe international isolation. Moscow has issued warrants for ICC staff in response to an arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin over the war in Ukraine. So Russia and Israel are actually both targets of the ICC process, which creates a strange irony. Two countries that find themselves on opposite sides of most questions are both being prosecuted by the same international court and both facing American diplomatic protection of a kind. But Russia's relationship with Israel has deteriorated sharply over the course of the Gaza war. Russia has consistently used its UN Security Council veto alongside China to block any American-sponsored resolution that would give Israel political cover. Russia has positioned itself in the Middle East as the patron of a multipolar order in which no single Western-backed state can operate with impunity, and Russia's media apparatus has been active. Investigations found China, Russia, and Iran coordinating propaganda campaigns in support of Hamas, including anti-Semitic and anti-American narratives online. These three countries are not operating independently in their opposition to Israeli policy. They are coordinating. They are synchronizing their messaging. They are working towards shared strategic objectives, even if their individual interests diverge significantly. And then there is Europe. The EU piece of this is perhaps the most historically significant because Europe has been Israel's most important source of moral legitimacy outside of the United States. The Holocaust was perpetrated in Europe. European guilt over that fact has been one of the foundational pillars of Israel's diplomatic standing for nearly 80 years. But that is changing. It is changing slowly, unevenly, with enormous internal disagreement. But it is changing in a direction that Israel's government cannot ignore and cannot simply dismiss. The EU-Israel Association Agreement, signed in 1995, grants Israeli exports preferential access to EU markets, making the European Union one of Israel's largest trading partners. But this agreement is under unprecedented scrutiny in 2025, with EU foreign ministers considering suspending it amid public pressure. That would be an economic earthquake for Israel. The EU is not a peripheral partner, it is central. Ireland and Spain have jointly pressed the EU to sanction Israel for its operations in Gaza and Lebanon and have suggested they would act on the ICC arrest warrant for Netanyahu. Lithuania, Slovenia, and even Austria, a firm historical ally of Israel, have signaled they would be legally obliged to comply with the warrant. Netanyahu skipped the 56th World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2026 to avoid the arrest warrant, since Switzerland is a Rome Statute signatory. The leader of one of America's closest allies cannot travel to a major international forum because he would be arrested. Let that sink in. The ICC arrest warrant, the first ever issued against the leader of a Western-backed democratic country for war crimes, is now actively reshaping where Netanyahu can travel, what forums he can attend, and how Israel presents itself to the world. And the ICC's resolve is firm. Throughout 2025, the US Trump administration imposed sanctions against court officials, a UN expert, and Palestinian civil society organizations, while Russian arrest warrants against ICC officials remain pending. Yet the court continues to function and the warrants remain in force. What you are watching here is a multi-front diplomatic siege. It is not military in the traditional sense. It is legal, economic, institutional, and moral. Turkey is building a regional alliance in the Middle East that explicitly excludes Israeli influence. China is using its UN Security Council veto and its economic leverage to deny Israel the diplomatic air cover it needs. Russia is coordinating with China and Iran to sustain a geopolitical bloc that treats Israeli military actions as illegitimate exercises of Western imperialism. And Europe, slowly, painfully, with enormous internal resistance, is beginning to enforce international law against an American ally in ways that Washington cannot simply override. As long as Netanyahu remains in power and the Iranian nuclear issue remains unresolved, the possibility of a new war looms, one that would differ significantly from earlier conflicts and that would place American strategic interests under severe strain. And this is where the American audience needs to pay very close attention, because this is not just about Israel. This is about what kind of world America is building or failing to build. For decades, the United States has premised its global leadership on the idea that it upholds a rules-based international order, that it defends sovereignty, international law, the rights of civilians in conflict, and the legitimacy of international institutions. The Gaza war has put enormous pressure on every single one of those premises. Every American veto at the UN Security Council that protects Israel from accountability is a withdrawal of moral capital from America's account with the world. Every set of sanctions Washington imposes on ICC prosecutors is a signal to every other country that the rules-based order applies selectively to America's adversaries but not to America's allies. Government efforts to undermine the ICC reflect broader attacks on the global rule of law, aiming to disable institutions that seek to hold those responsible for the worst crimes accountable. Now, you might be thinking, so what? America has always played this game. America has always protected its allies and it has survived just fine. And that is a fair point up to a degree. But the degree matters, because what is different about this moment is the scale and the coherence of the opposition forming on the other side. With Russia bogged down in Ukraine, the United States seeking to reduce its global footprint, Iran suffering losses throughout the region, and Israel reeling from crises at home and abroad, Turkey can exploit these openings in any direction in which it has fundamental interests. Turkey is not just reacting anymore. It is expanding. It is becoming a regional power of the first order, with a defense industry that is now among the most advanced in the world, with military presences in Libya, Syria, Somalia, and Qatar, with influence stretching across the Balkans, Central Asia, and Africa. And Turkey has decided, under Erdogan's leadership, for reasons that mix genuine moral conviction with cold strategic calculation, that opposing Israeli policy in Gaza is its ticket to regional and global prestige. When you combine that Turkish ambition with China's patient global repositioning, with Russia's bitter determination to delegitimize the Western-led order, and with Europe's growing legal and economic discomfort with Israeli conduct, you get something new in the world. You get a broad, multilateral, increasingly institutionalized pressure system being applied to a country that the United States has committed itself to defend in almost unconditional terms. And that creates an enormous problem for American credibility, American economic interests, and ultimately American security, because America cannot indefinitely maintain a rules-based world order while simultaneously exempting its closest allies from the rules. The two positions are in fundamental contradiction, and the rest of the world, the global south, the Arab states, the rising powers of Asia and Africa, is watching that contradiction play out in real time and drawing their own conclusions. Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, coupled with its continued and unprovoked military actions in Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere, shifted the regional balance of power, alienating Gulf Cooperation Council states, which view Israel's pursuit of hegemony as a direct threat to their interests in maintaining regional stability. The Abraham Accords, that celebrated achievement of Trump's first term, that framework of Arab-Israeli normalization, have stalled. Saudi Arabia is not joining. The UAE is uncomfortable. Qatar was literally bombed by Israel in September 2025, in an attack that China strongly condemned. The entire architecture of American Middle East policy, the architecture that was supposed to culminate in a grand normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia that would reshape the region for a generation, is under enormous pressure precisely because of the conduct of the Netanyahu government that the United States refuses to constrain. This is the picture that emerges when you look at it honestly, without the partisan filters that American media puts on everything. This is not a left-wing or right-wing analysis. This is geopolitics, power, interests, legitimacy, and the slow but inexorable shifting of alignments in a world that is no longer willing to accept American exceptionalism as an organizing principle. The world is changing around Israel and around America simultaneously. And the question that every thoughtful American citizen needs to be asking right now is not simply, should we support Israel? The question is, what does unconditional, uncritical support for a government that is now under siege from its own allies, from international courts, from the rising powers of the multipolar world, what does that support actually cost us? What does it cost in terms of relationships, in terms of credibility, in terms of the long-term strategic positioning of the United States in a world that is rapidly reorganizing itself around a new set of moral and political norms? Because when Turkey, China, Russia, and significant parts of Europe are all moving in the same direction at the same time, you have to ask yourself, is this a coincidence, or is this the world telling us something important that we have been refusing to hear?